Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, December 2nd, 2019. I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. I'm actually time traveling a little bit because although I'm recording this in my studio in Los Angeles, I am currently it looks like I've just landed in Melbourne, Australia from Christchurch, where I'm doing a little tour with the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe at the Skeptic conventions there in that part of the world. So if I just saw you in Christchurch, that was fun, I think, even though it hasn't happened yet. All right, I'm really excited about this week's show. We get to talk to Dr. Robert Crease. But before I dive into all that, I want to thank those of you who have made Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download. And that's because of support from listeners just like you. Those of you who have gone to patreon.com/talknerdy and pledged your support, I thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. I want to also just give a shout out to the top supporters this week, and they include Sinai, Ulrika Hagman, Pedro M. Rosario Barbosa, Dudas Infinitas, Phil T. Bear, The Zombie Drummer, David J. E. Smith, Brian Holden, and Jeffrey Sewell. All right, guys, so let's talk about this week's show. It is, oh my gosh, it's such a good one. It's everything I love. So this week, I get to talk to Dr. Robert Crease. He's the chair of the philosophy department at Stony Brook University. He has a brand new book out called The Workshop and the World, What 10 Thinkers Can Teach Us About Science and Authority. So this book is all about kind of the public's relationship with the idea of authority and science denial. This is about what we can learn from the past, from experiences of past thinkers and the social context in which they existed. And, how that is telling us a lot about what's going on in our society right now. So it's a really, really good one, guys. I can't say better things about it. So I think probably the best thing to do is, I don't know, just listen. I guess without any further ado, here he is, Dr. Robert Crease. Well, Robert, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me, Cara.
Absolutely. So I've been really looking forward to chatting about your newest book. At this point, it did come out a few months ago now, right? Because we're recording this in November.
Yes, it came out in March.
Yeah. And it's been sitting on my shelf, and I've been periodically looking at the individual stories of the different chapters in the book. It's such a timely and important topic that you dive into really deftly, but you do it through a survey of history, which I think is really, really important. That kind of classic saying that history is going to repeat itself, and we must learn from history, but it's something that we very, I think, rarely want to do or want to have to do. So do you think that it would be safe for me to say that the main theme, if we had to pick one of this book, is kind of a warning against science denial?
Sure. I mean, it's an exploration of the authority of science. How much authority should science have? How do you gain it? How do you lose it? And if you lose it, how to regain it again? But as you said, I like to go back to the beginning. That is, nowadays we need science input into governmental policy and decisions more than ever. The key existential questions facing the planet all require scientific input. The global warming being one, pollution being another. And what I thought I'd do, and yet we have politicians who make a point out of denying the importance, the authority of science. In fact, it's somehow appealing to voters. It's a mark of anti-elitism to reject the authority of science. So what I thought I'd do, and you put it really well, is to go back to the beginning. That is, in the first few decades when the modern science began, there were people like Bacon and Galileo and Descartes who argued for that science should have authority, and This was when no science yet existed. There were no cell phones, no automobiles, no Higgs bosons. And so they had to argue to the people around them and the politicians around them and the political leaders around them that science had authority and that science was a source of authority worth, in fact, essential to listen to. But they met resistance. They met the first science deniers, and they had to cope with that resistance. So what I thought I'd do for the book is to go back and look at the experiences of these first people who argued for the authority of science, see how they did it, see what kind of resistance, what kind of denial they encountered, and see how they coped with that denial. And I hope to find clues for what to do today from their stories.
I mean, I think that that's so important because so often we think of sort of the modern era as something that is much more advanced, much more sophisticated, almost as if we're a different species, as if we've evolved beyond the cognitive biases and the geopolitical and kind of tribalistic issues that may have existed hundreds of years ago. But ultimately, you're really seeing kind of the same theme recapitulating. Just because we now have, as you put it, modern science, like it is an institution, we have a lot of publications, we have consensus on several topics. That doesn't mean that everybody knows how to think scientifically or even respects the scientific method the way that maybe people who have studied might, or people who have taken the time or even have had the opportunity and the privilege to think about these things philosophically have.
You're right. We think of ourselves as different, but in a way, we're in a very similar situation. That is, it's a question of trusting people who know more than we do. I mean, the basic question is authority, and authority means someone has authority if they're able to get people to defer to them with comfort in situations where the people are vulnerable. So, modern society is run by experts. When do we defer to experts? And that's not necessarily when should we defer to experts? And that's not a scientific issue. That's a question of who you trust, and how much you need the advice and how seriously you take the advice.
Which is interesting because there's almost a sheen or a facade to science that somehow it doesn't require uh, that kind of bowing to authority, that there's something a little bit more populist or egalitarian about it, that the whole point of the scientific method is that like I can observe with my own eyes and I can find confirming or disconfirming evidence, like that science is not about the monarchy, it's about the people. Yet of course, not everybody is going to dedicate their lives to the type of study that's required in order to understand sophisticated science.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the solution to science denial is not to make everyone scientists. You, and a lot of scientists just don't take it seriously. They assume that people
Mhm.
denying science do so because they're irrational or they have a hidden agenda or they're stupid. And the point is, no, there are being able to trust experts is something more than that. And how science gained this authority so that people trusted it and then lost it, and how to regain it, that's the issue that the book is about.
Do you think that we can talk about science denial, and obviously this occurs on several different levels. There is denial of individual topics within science, there is denial of kind of the idea of science as an institution, or of things that are maybe disconfirming for individual agendas or tribes. And then there's this kind of more severe, I would say even insipid, societal issue of like you said, kind of denying or being afraid of authority as a whole. And it seems like, and some amount of that is obviously very healthy, but then when you go beyond it, it seems like you're kind of almost moving past science denial and into like conspiratorial thinking. Do you think that that really is what underlies, it's kind of the central theme of most conspiracy thinking? Is just this, I do not want to trust authority?
Oh, absolutely. No, you make a good point. First of all, it's science denial. People who do it don't deny all science. They just pick and choose. So the same people who deny global warming, let's say, will go to doctors and take the medicines they prescribe or consult engineers for buildings and so forth. But it's only in certain select areas where they practice science denial. So the question is why they do that, and it um, has and you can distrust, say, one particular scientist or the organization that scientist comes from, or the scientist message, or the whole scientific community. And what I think you were getting at was that the now it's different. Now what happens is politicians make a point of, including our president, make a point of denying the science as a whole, if for political purposes. That is, when Bobby Jindal of Louisiana rejected his scientific advice, he said that he was being a populist in the model of Huey Long, one of his predecessors. So it's become, science denial has now become part of political posturing. I don't know if you meant if that's what you meant by conspiracies, but
Well, I think that that's a big part of it. I was even thinking beyond, because the other podcast that I work on, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, one of the things that we deal with quite often is kind of pseudoscience, extreme pseudoscience. And so sometimes that comes in the form of like actual conspiracy thinking, kind of like believing in a Loch Ness monster, or in psychics, or believing that there is a vast liberal conspiracy to um, uh, uh, prop up the green energy sector, so that like, and perpetrate this lie of climate change, this hoax of climate change. Like, the people who get really really steeped into it, to the extent that some other people might be like, that's like a tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorist. That really is, in some ways, the extreme version of basic science denial.
yes, wait, a couple of things. First of all, it's important to distinguish science denial from pseudoscience and skepticism. I mean, suppose I go to a doctor, and the doctor tells me you have this very serious illness, you have to take this kind of medicine. And I say, well, I'm going to take this other medicine that I heard about that I can get in Mexico and hasn't been approved by the certain studies that were made approve it. That's adopting pseudoscience. That's when what you are arguing is trying to pass itself off as science. But then suppose you go to the doctor and instead you say that you hear this news from the doctor and you say, wait, I've heard other doctors say this, and I've had other friends who have taken this other medicine, and it's okay, and I've done my research. That's skepticism. That's where you really take the time to research yourself. But on the other hand, if I go to the doctor and I say, you're wrong, you're lying, that's science denial. So you have to distinguish between these three things.
Yeah, I think that's important. Do you think, though, that science denial often feeds into adapting pseudoscientific views?
Oh yeah, because then you tend to look for something to justify yourself. I mean that's you see that in the anti-vax thing. I mean you there's this one study by Wakefield that says that links autism and vaccinations. Well, it was a study that has been withdrawn, and the sample size was 17 or so. So and Wakefield himself has become a kind of celebrity, looked upon as an expert by the anti-vax community. So if you deny mainstream science, one of the things that you do is look around for somebody that you can cite as an expert, even if they aren't at all respectable.
Isn't it funny then that there's still this underlying kind of need? It's almost impossible to slog through modern society and not have a certain level of trust in expertise, of trust in authority, because, it's only the most extreme version. And that's kind of where I was getting with the idea um, of conspiracy thinkers, right? It's only the most extreme version in which you can just say, I don't trust anybody, and I'm going to question everything to the extent that it's not a healthy skepticism, but it's actually an outright denial. And anytime anybody is in a position of power, I'm going to assume that they're working against my interests, as opposed to a healthy skepticism like we discussed, which is, what is their agenda? Who are they being funded by? Is this a political move, or is this actually based on the evidence? There's this kind of extreme version where people just don't trust any authority figures, but for the most part, you really can't survive in the modern world without putting your faith in a handful of things that you just don't have the competency to understand yourself.
Right, and also sometimes it's justified. I mean, the scientists involved who were brought forward by the tobacco industry, for instance, or by the Atomic Energy Commission, and so forth. Sometimes you're justified in assuming there's a conspiracy. That's why
Yeah, the
skepticism
Tuskegee syphilis trials, for example. Yeah.
perfect example, and think of the lingering impact on that. It's very difficult to often to bring to do studies in minority communities just because Tuskegee is a model for how they can be abused. Um, but you mentioned conspiracies. Yeah, every time the groundwork for the landscape that makes conspiracy theories possible is any kind of social stratification. Whenever you involved a level of experts and who are governing or giving advice to a public that is not fully familiar with the experts, that kind of social stratification is a breeding ground for conspiracy theories. So that's partly what's involved here. I mean, think of climate change. It's incredibly difficult to understand the science of climate change. It involves so many models, so much interdisciplinary work, so many different fields, that any given person who studies it only understands a small piece of it. So it has to be pieced together in a very complicated way. So when you have no single person on top of that, then that's almost an invitation to be suspicious.
It's true. And there's also, it has become highly politicized. There's also some disagreement about certain uh, I'd say factors within there is like a main consensus, and then there's some, confusion about, if this model versus that model is the most appropriate. And anytime, unfortunately, individuals see scientists themselves disagreeing, or they see them iterating, which is how science works, right? Like we find new evidence, we can disconfirm old evidence, and we can move forward. People might see that from a more political view. I think that our political leaders have established this mentality in us that if we change our minds, that means that we're no longer trustworthy, that we're a flip flopper, instead of, no, I changed my mind because I learned something new and I evolved. Unfortunately, that we see is like weak in our society and not to be trusted.
Right. I've several thoughts about that. One of which is that the climate change is so incredibly complicated. There are many, many hundreds of dials, and you have to know exactly where to set the dials. And there's uncertainty in a few of them, such as the behavior of water vapor and clouds and so forth. But they themselves don't add to the overall picture. But it's easy for opponents to look at the uncertainty and say, "Oh, see, the scientists are uncertain." But that leads me to the other point you made, which is that science actually is part of the point of my book. My book said, "How does this happen?" And there are some things that make science go that also make it vulnerable to science denial. And one of them is the fact that it's open-ended. It's always subject to reanalysis. It's always subject to new evidence. New evidence can get people to change their minds. And because of that, you can get people like Scott Pruitt saying, "Well, the climate science is constantly changing. In a few years, maybe we will think differently." So there's always new evidence out there. So the very thing that this is the ironic thing that I talk about in the book, that the very things that make science strong, that make it go, the gears that drive it, also appear to give a veneer of legitimacy to those who would deny it. So the fact that just to repeat myself, the fact that it's always open-ended, revisable in the face of new evidence or analysis, make it possible to say, well, let's wait for that. And see, that's one thing that goes all the way back to Galileo. Do you want to hear a Galileo story or?
Absolutely. I mean, that's kind of what I was going to say is that obviously there are some takeaways from this that we will get to, but I want to go back to the beginning. Like, what were they dealing with? What was the pushback?
Well, different kinds of pushback. So pushback that Bacon got was just governmental inertia. Why should we adopt your plan when it requires spending a lot of money and we don't know whether it will work on that?
Check. Okay, so we still deal with that today, like every day.
Yes, and so he had proposed a utopia. He used many things. He used the language of the Bible, for instance. That the in the Bible there were that there are two books: the book of nature and the book of Scripture. And the book of Scripture is about how to be moral, and the book of nature is about how to understand nature. So he would use biblical language and fables and short stories in order to communicate the importance of doing science. Galileo also did that too. The primary pushback he got was not from the government, but for Bacon it was King James, but for him it was the religious authorities. His primary pushback was against the religious authorities. And remember, I mean, this is a long story I tell in the book, but there are only a few sentences in the Bible that contradict what Galileo was saying in the heliocentric model of the universe. But after the Reformation, in the post Council of Trent era, even if you had remember the Protestant idea was that everyone can interpret the Bible for themselves. You didn't need the whole infrastructure of the church. But the church insisted, no, they had the right to interpret the Bible, to provide the authoritative interpretation. And if only a few sentences of the Bible appeared to be contradicted by the new science, that was a problem. And that's what got Galileo in trouble. Now, what Galileo did was, and I think this is very instructive for today, he took his opponent's own authorities, that is, the religious authorities, and turned those authorities against them. That is, he went right back at them. So he quoted Saint Augustine. He quoted Tertullian. He quoted all the church fathers as saying studying nature is important. And he pointed out that the Bible was not about nature, that the Bible was about being moral, being spiritual. There's only one planet mentioned in the Bible, it seems, Venus, and it's bizarrely given the name Lucifer. But he had this wonderful statement that he was a very good writer. I mean, Italo Calvino said that he was the best writer in the Italian language, but he could be very pithy and sarcastic. And at one point, he says, "The Bible doesn't teaches us how to go to heaven, not how heaven goes," and which is a very witty remark. And I imagine somebody nowadays saying something like, "The founding fathers taught us to legislate creation." No, sorry, I blew the joke. The founding fathers taught us to create legislation, not to legislate creation.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the kind of thing. Again, appealing to the people who the science deniers consider authoritative. That is, the founding fathers. So what Galileo did was turn the very arguments of his opponents against them.
Do you think that when you are reading, you're steeped in your research and you're thinking about these things philosophically, does it ever like frighten you or piss you off, or just like, do you ever find yourself being like, how are we still dealing with the same basic, basic issues that we were dealing with during Galileo's time? Like, how have these conflicts not become maybe a little bit more sophisticated?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't find it surprising that we're dealing with the same basic issues. I mean, remember, I'm a philosopher. We're still worrying about the nature of the good, which is something Plato and Aristotle worried about. We're still exploring justice and beauty and so forth. So we're wrestling the same issues. What is what makes me incredibly angry, and I hope that shows up in the book, is the fact that the stakes are so much higher and that we expect our politicians to be much more to be governing wisely, and the evidence is so much clearer. So it's not so much the issues involved; it's the clarity of the stakes involved. We're facing an existential crisis, and the people who we've elected to the highest offices are still governing in their own self interest.
Why do you think it is that natural sciences, especially, and especially the politicized natural sciences, are have this like unique status amongst politicians where you'll literally hear them say things like, well, I'm not a scientist, so my view is the blah 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 populist one, but you never hear them say things like, well, I'm not an economist, or I'm not a financial expert. But those things are true too, but somehow they feel like they can speak with authority on everything but science, and science is the place where they're able to like deny authority outright.
That's a good question. I'm not exactly sure how to answer it. My suspicion is that the reason has to do with the fact that the existential crisis that we face depends so directly upon facts in the natural science about which there is such a strong consensus. That is, I don't think you could say the same for the social sciences.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, obviously, you've said this multiple times, and it really is one of the kind of hallmarks of this book, but it's like the very thing that makes science such a strong kind of institution is the thing that helps people who are agenda driven sort of try and argue for loopholes within it or deconstruct its kind of conclusions. And it's almost like the flip side of that. You would think that because there is so much consensus on certain issues, that it would be easier for somebody who is in a position where they don't really understand the science themselves, because again, they're not a scientist, that they could just say, oh, I don't even have to think about this. Of course, climate change is real. I mean, 97% of climate scientists all, argue for that.
Yeah, and that's another thing that makes science strong and which makes it work, which also makes it vulnerable, which is the fact that it's technical. I mean, that's related to the point I made a few minutes ago about strata. Is that science works partly because it's abstract. Things are you abstract from a lot of a lot of things in order to discover a kind of background or framework on which you can evaluate what's happening, and so it's technical. And Galileo, for instance, knew this, that it was the his comment was, there's the book of scripture and the book of nature, and the book of scripture is written in a language for ordinary people. The book of nature is written in the language of mathematics, he said, so that in order to understand nature, you had to understand mathematics. Now that implies that was a huge importance, because it implies that you can't understand nature without understanding this technical language of mathematics, which meant that there's the birth of what we now call the two cultures, the humanities and the sciences. Is that you need to understand this special language, this technical language, which leaves people on the other side feeling like they're excluded from it. So you just referred to people saying, "I am not a scientist." That is really commonly said. It's been said by Robert Kennedy Jr. when, in the face of the autism studies. It's been said by many of the congressmen. And it's been said by Justice Roberts, who, when he was the Supreme Court Justice Roberts, who, when he was confronted with mathematical evidence of gerrymandering, said, "Well, I'm not a scientist. I'm just looking at issues involving democracy. So the fact that there's a gap between the language of science and ordinary language seems to justify people saying, well, that technical stuff is not relevant here.
I have to ask, and it might sound like it's coming a little bit out of left field, but I promise you it's not. Do you think that your approach to, the work that you do in philosophy, but also like the popular writing, the history of science work that you do, is unique amongst kind of academic philosophers, amongst your peers and colleagues, because you so seamlessly just then switched between talking about something that is very important historically, and that is very kind of requires, I think, a lot of sophisticated historical knowledge, to a an, a very important modern like issue that's happening right now and that is really politically charged. And I feel like sometimes when I communicate with academics, they are like, I don't want to talk about politics. I don't want to go there. I that's not my purview, and I need to kind of stay in my lane, which I think can be really dangerous because you end up with these silos, these siloed understandings that we don't synthesize very well.
Oh, absolutely, and thank you for pointing that out. Yes, I do feel like I'm different. I don't want to be in one silo. I don't want to be in one lane. I mean, what's the point? I know my academic colleagues will almost all agree with me, but what I want to communicate something different, which is something that you can only communicate via stories. That is, stories are special. People can get up and can get caught up in stories to see a deeper lesson that they couldn't without the story. I mean, that's the point of Aesop's fables, is that it's not about a turtle and a hare or a tiger or a fox. It's about something else that emerges more directly and clearly in the story than if you wrote technical studies. So that's what I consider this book to be. It's not just 10 individual story. It's 10 individual stories that each of which make a point. But then the overall story of those stories is an even bigger point.
Yeah, and it's a point that's also
Is that what you mean?
absolutely, and it's not only is it relevant today, but it's, I think, sometimes hard for some people to talk about because, I mean, we struggle with this in my other show, in The Skeptic's Guide, because we have a multifaceted audience. We have conservative listeners and liberal listeners, and we have libertarian listeners, and we talk about scientific skepticism and we dive into that. So often, scientific skepticism has an application that has direct implications for politics. But if we start to talk too deeply about politics, or we start to identify too much with individual political leanings, which I'm sure at this point you can tell that I'm like ultra left, but some people on the show don't want to kind of show their hand. What ends up happening is that the discourse is shut off. People immediately say like, oh, you're just like a liberal bleeding heart, I don't want to listen to you anymore. Or on the flip side, oh, whatever, you're like rocking your MAGA hat, there's no way that you're going to be able to have a rational discussion about this. Like actually getting into the grit of the politics and the emotional shit is sometimes messy, and it almost makes, I think, a lot of kind of academics afraid, because they're afraid that then their academic lessons are going to be lost in the emotional foray.
Oh, sure. I mean, it's so clear to people on the left and to scientists what the right answer is, that they can only see the opponents as being irrational or illiterate, scientifically illiterate, or stupid, or corrupt or something. But I think there's more to it than that. I mean, people aren't. It's more complicated than that. Well, then how do you appeal to those people? And I thought that my ideas was stories of human beings at work trying to do the best that they could was the best way to communicate that.
All right, guys, let's get back to the show. Absolutely. I was hoping maybe, we talked about starting at the beginning with Bacon and Galilei and Descartes, but then you move forward into other both scientists and like philosophers, and how some of their I guess those conflicts, those difficulties that they ran into can be very telling for us in a modern world. Are there any stories that really stand out to you that you feel like it would be important for the listeners to hear maybe before they go and buy the book?
Yes, there's all of them is the
Like
answer,
all of
but
them. Yeah, that's why I wrote the
well,
book.
that's why I picked those, because each of them has a
Yeah.
different, Galileo, Bacon, and Descartes wrote at a time when science did not exist yet. They had a dream, but when the dream starts to be realized, then people begin to spot problems with the dream. And issues with it. People can get too involved with science so that they forget about what philosophers call the life world. Or science can be dangerous. The story of Frankenstein that Mary Shelley wrote. But I guess one of my, well, they're all my favorite stories, but one of the stories I think the most interesting was, I didn't want this to be just about the West. This isn't just a European problem. So I wrote about the Ottoman Empire that used to be one of the great empires of the world. It rivaled the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, but about the 18th century, 17th, 18th century, it began losing battles to the West. And it became obvious that the reason it was losing battles had a lot to do with the fact of the new science and the new technology that the Western powers had. Now, what to do? How can do you import this science and technology? If you do, you're importing um, stuff that's been invented by and developed by heathens. So the question was, could you import knowledge from the West and still be a good Ottoman citizen and a believing Muslim? And the result was about 100 years long cultural debate at all levels, from the highest level, from the Sultan down to newspapers and poems and plays and so forth and cartoons, about whether how to cope with this, what the virtue was in adopting Western science and technology. And the point was, here was an existential threat, and they were discussing how to do with it in a culture wide debate. Well, that's the kind of debate that we need, that the West needs to have again. It did once upon a time, and and we need to do it again. So that's one of my favorite stories in the book.
It's still happening, right? I mean, it's like that's obviously why you wrote it, but it's still so important, this idea of these kind of culture, I guess, wars. I hate to use such a cliche, but like this idea of these culture wars, these disagreements about fundamental moral issues or fundamental kind of religious issues that maybe preclude the ability to share technology or the ability to share iterative knowledge. Um, between tribes, between societies. I mean, it's funny when sorry to take a tangent, but again, I mentioned the other show that I work on. We argue a lot about space exploration. We argue a lot about kind of futurism and this idea of uh colonial, basically what I view as like a colonial kind of very Western male view of like we need to go and we need to settle on other lands, and I'm very like against this view, um, and there seems to be this kind of intrinsic moral conflict that even though the science might be uh, non-emotional, I don't know how to put it. There's a fundamental like should we that comes out of it. And one of the arguments that I often make about settling Mars, for example, when people say, "Oh, we'll have the technology in 50, 100 years. Don't worry, we're going to be there." I'm like, "Yeah, but we're not going to have the human capability. Like we physically can't not go to war. We physically can't like have like appropriate diplomacy still to this day, and we think that just because the technology takes us somewhere, that somehow humans are going to become more sophisticated in our thinking. And in my view, modern science and technology is highly outpacing our basic kind of philosophical and humanitarian evolution. Is this something that you grapple with?
Oh, sure. No, that goes back. That basically goes back to the issue we talked about before in terms of, is it desirable to make everyone a scientist? The thing is, it would be nice if there were some switch and we could switch it on, and humanity would suddenly go, "Oh yeah, we have to trust scientists." But there is none, and there will never be one. The battle for establishing authority will be ongoing. It's sort of like trusting someone in a relationship. There's no switch you can turn on to say, "Oh yeah, this person will trust me. I will trust this person." It's trusting is always always involves a monitoring and looking for whether things are going wrong or not. So the struggle to promote and maintain the authority of science is going to continue and should continue. And part of it will be having to tell the story of what it's like if we don't trust science. I mean, that's another of my. If I could stop and talk about another of my favorite stories, uh, that of Auguste Comte, who was a French philosopher, and he realized that science, as few scientists did, that science is not inherently self-authenticating. That is, people have to be convinced. People have to be reminded of how terrible things were before modern science. And so, one of the things that he argued for that was needed in the future was to periodically tell the story of how we got to be, how humanity got to be where it is, and what it was like when we thought that we had to appease the gods to keep the floods from happening or the lightning from striking.
Oh,
Um,
so important. So, and we forget to do that all the time.
Yeah, and what I compared it to was a seder. That is, how at the seder people tell the story of how of the liberation from Egypt to sort of remind ourselves, remind the people who are telling it who they are and where they came from. That's Kant in effect said that in order to maintain the authority of modern science, you need something like a scientific seder to retell the story again, and that's part of what I thought I was hoping to do in the book.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I guess take it to its extreme though. And I think it's equally important, and I know that you do too because you talk about it in the book. This idea of, and sometimes I actually find, sorry, I'm like restarting my thought 10 times over. Sometimes working as a science communicator, I see these arguments and these struggles within the scientific communication uh, community, which is I need to advocate for science, even though, like, I'm not a journalist, I'm a communicator. And so I need to advocate for science because there's such a big trust issue that I don't want to tell stories that are going to induce any sort of questioning because it's going to undermine the point of advocating for science. But we all see what happens too when you have this almost this purely logical positivist, this almost like religious fervor for science. I mean, you see it's happening in Silicon Valley right now with a kind of futurist, almost like libertarian futurist movement that can actually be kind of scary and a little go off the rails, as if science has all the keys to morality, or as if science can solve every ethical or philosophical problem on the planet. Like, science is what science is, but it's not other things. If that makes sense.
That raises a whole bunch of complicated issues. I mean, which is how do you advocate for science? I mean, my Stony Brook, where I teach, has a science communications workshop. It's the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science. It was set up by the actor Alan Alda, who's very interested in science, and it teaches scientists how to communicate what they do better. That's good, but it's only a part of it. It's the public won't trust science. Will trust science a little bit more if the scientists can communicate better. But it's the feeling that what is really needed is the feeling that science is not just a specific interest, but a general interest. That is, in the halls of Congress or in government. scientists are just one voice among many, housing poverty and so forth. And how to communicate that those voices are not speaking just for an interest group, but for of general interest, of general social interest. And that's the struggle, and that's the struggle that's going to have to continue. But I think but you were talking about something different, which is specific.
Like a dogmatism, like a worship of science that goes beyond what the purpose of the scientific method is, and almost deifies science to be able to answer questions or solve problems that are not even kind of within the purview, because it's not you're not capable of disconfirming evidence in those areas.
Well, so, sometimes that's important. I mean, science. Another side of science is symbolism, and the sometimes the symbolism is useful for gathering support for science. So I'm thinking of the large particle accelerators, discovery of the Higgs boson, or the program that Kennedy announced in 1961 to land someone on the moon. Now that galvanized a lot of public interest, but as you point out, there are other initiatives that are kind of red herrings in terms of social impact and social importance.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess my biggest concern lately, because I'm so active within the skeptic community, and I know that this is maybe a very small concern because science denial as a whole is a much larger issue, but this like rabid, like science is the only way to truth, this idea that science, and I agree, science is kind of in many ways the best epistemology that we have, because I mean, that's what I do for a living, right? I'm a science communicator and evangelizer to some extent. And I agree that science as an epistemology is like super, super important because it's iterative and it has, the scientific method is the best method we have, but it doesn't apply to everything. And I think that that's where the breakdown comes in when people think that science is the only epistemology and that it's fully applicable to every single moral or philosophical problem.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I love the skeptical community. I believe in what they do. On the other hand, it can have a certain tone, and the tone is our opponents are scientifically illiterate. There's a rising tide of irrationalism in the country today, and so forth. And I just don't think that that's helpful, because ultimately people trust science and accept the authority of science, not not out of scientific reasons, but out of human reasons. They have to think that it's, as Comte said, that science will help them live better, and that's not that's something that you have to appeal to personal experience and personal notions for what the good is. I mean, most people aren't scientists, and they shouldn't be. They're
Yeah,
doctors, or
humanity.
lawyers, or sportsmen, or their parents, and so forth. And you have to appeal to the kinds of values that those people have living in their lives, not just scientific values. And again, that's why I think stories are the way to go, rather than denunciations. I mean, in science magazines, every few weeks, you've seen them in Nature and Science and so forth. There's denunciations of very specific, compelling refutations of science deniers, but they have an impact. So we have to ask the question: what? And this is a kind of epistemology too. What gets this is a kind of epistemology you have to study. What? How do you c- communicate and convince people who aren't scientists of the authority of science?
Exactly. I mean, it's so self-apparent if you study science, right? But to the extent that it almost seems cult-like to the outside, it's like, oh, you go to a quote liberal institution, you study the scientific method, and all of a sudden you can't see the world any other way. Of course, the scientific method is the best method we have, and blah 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 blah. But from an outsider, that seems religious. From an outsider, that seems like a cult. Like, why? Why should I believe and trust that? And I don't want to even dip my toe in, because the minute that I do, they're going to get me, with their liberal knowledge. And it's a very difficult thing to communicate to people who like overtly do not trust. And so we've, for decades in the science communication, community were like, oh, it's a knowledge deficit problem. It's a knowledge deficit problem. And then we started to do actual social science work on the problem and realized, no, it's freaking not. We can't just shove more information in people's faces. That is not how you open up the conversation. So what is the solution?
Exactly. It is not a knowledge deficit a problem. It's a well. Let me tell you about my favorite photograph in the book. My favorite photograph, I don't know if you saw it at the very end, shows somebody sitting in the middle of railroad tracks, reading a newspaper with his dog by his side, and he's facing up the railroad tracks. And the question, you can imagine this, right? If you don't have it in front
Yeah,
of you.
I'm actually looking at it right now. But yes, everybody listening can imagine
It's
that.
a pretty dramatic photograph, especially when it's in
Yeah,
color.
he's like on the track.
He's right on the tracks. And the tracks, turn a corner so that you expect any minute a locomotive is going to come down. And the question is, he's stupid for sitting in the tracks. Well, there's two ways that you could prevent him from getting killed. One of which is put someone from the outside putting greater regulations on. You have more police. You have barbed wire surrounding the tracks so that he can't get off. You have warning signs. But that doesn't change what's in his head, because in his head, he feels comfortable, and he feels that people yelling on him to get off the tracks are, they're part of the liberal elite. They want him off for other reasons. They're getting paid off and so forth. And those ways forcibly get him off the tracks. But the key thing is to get inside his head and make him convinced, leave him convinced that it's dangerous to be on the tracks. So you have to get inside his head rather than forcefully remove him from the tracks. And that's the kind of epistemology that we need. How do you convince him that he's in danger? And there again, I think stories will do that better than shouting at him.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit. I see a parallel with some of the clinical work that I've been doing, the therapy work that I've been doing lately, where and that really has opened my eyes up as a skeptic, having this more kind of empathic view of where people come from. It reminds me of, I think, the arguments that we see in the addiction world, where historically legislation and policy has been all about removing access to the drugs. Somebody who is struggling with addiction, well, if they can't get the heroin, or if it's more illegal, or if we lock them up in a treatment facility where they can't, and yes, that solves the problem in the short term, but ultimately, if we're not approaching why that person keeps using over and over and over, and we're not getting to the basic psychological issues that this coping mechanism are alleviating, that this palliation is providing, then what is the point? Like, it's like we're trying to medicate a problem that has a vaccine. Like, why not prevent it? And I think that's the real issue that we struggle with across the board. And I think that image is such a perfect example of that. Like, how do we meet a person where they're at instead of trying to speak to them in French about an issue that they only know in German?
Right, but the problem is, it's especially if you know French really well. That's the easiest way that you can think of to talk to that person. I mean, I also refer to that's a real temptation that we were talking about before. I also refer in the book to the movie Jaws. You've seen Jaws, right?
Oh, yeah.
Well, I show there's a spot right near the beginning that involves three people on the beach: the mayor, the scientist played by the nerdy Richard Dreyfuss, and the sheriff. And the scientist says there's a shark out there. You have to close the beaches. The mayor says we can't close the beaches because there's so much because our economic well-being depends on it. And by the way, and do you have any evidence? And actually, you just want to get in the pages of the National Geographic. And then the sheriff is trying to figure out what to do. Now, in my classes, I show in science and technology, I show this 2-minute clip at the beginning of the class, and I say this is the scariest part of the movie. It's far scarier than any of those scenes involving sharks, because you see immediately why the mayor is doing what he's doing and that he's justified doing it. That is, um, he's elected to represent the people in the town. He knows the people in the town. His well-being, his job is to protect the well-being, the economic well-being of the people in the town. Whereas nobody knows who Richard Dreyfuss is. And he's nerdy. He has no social skills. He has no evidence that the mayor can understand. So the point is the mayor is not irrational. He's not scientifically illiterate. He knows what a shark is. And so that whole scene sets the problem. But the real problem is we are sitting in the audience of the movie. We know there's a shark out there because we've heard the music and we've probably seen it times before. We know there's a shark out there, and we can easily say, you're such an idiot, believe Richard Dreyfuss. But if you were on the beach, it would be very difficult to decide who to believe.
It's true, and I mean, it takes me back to trying to put myself in the shoes of, and sometimes I've got to admit, even as somebody who's working as a therapist, like I said, who's really striving to always be as empathic as possible, putting myself in the shoes of somebody in a Trump rally where he is, talking about this hoax and that hoax, and he's sowing all sorts of disinformation, and a person with a much more populist view, who is really concerned about the economic well-being of their family, and I'm maybe talking about somebody in the audience who's not racially motivated and who's not, nationalistic, but just somebody who's in the audience who literally is listening to these things and they just make sense to them. It's such a sometimes really difficult thing to do, to meet somebody there, but it's so important for us to be able to do it.
Well, you see, that's where you use the word "makes sense," and those are the two key words, because things don't make sense on their own. Things make sense only in the context of a bigger story. But once again, you have to figure out a way how to retell that bigger story, so all of a sudden it doesn't make sense anymore.
And I think that, there are luckily, some very good outlets and organizations that get that and who have always gotten that. I really advocate that I think everybody should watch Frontline on PBS because I think it's one of the best documentary series of our modern era. It's very, in many ways, neutral, but it's also beautiful in terms of its, I mean, as neutral as you can be, but it's beautiful in terms of its contextualization as an investigative journalistic unit, so that when they tell the story of Trump getting elected, they tell the as whole a story as they can about where the country is at that point in time and why people want a leader like Trump. Because if you look at these things in isolation, like you said, they don't make sense. You have to have the context.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. You need to tell as big a story as possible, so big that people can recognize their own role and their own past beliefs in that story,
Yeah, and
so that you can understand a big story, a big enough story so that you can tell, oh, here's why Trump supporters see that they fit in. Here's why it makes sense for Trump, for people to vote for Trump. Only if you tell that big a story do you have any chance of moving beyond where we are now.
Yeah, I mean, to maybe borrow a more physics, not even an astronomy metaphor for the listeners out here who are stargazers, you can't start looking for the thing that you're looking for in the sky, the celestial object, a Messier object, for example, on the highest field of view, because you lose all context. You're never going to be able to find it. Same thing with microscopes, right? When you're looking for an individual organism under the microscope, you have to start on the lowest field of view possible so that you can get the entire context of what you're looking at. Then you can focus in and you can start doing the more specific work. But periodically you'll lose it and you've got to widen back up so that you can find it again. It's the only way that you can really understand something is in its connected context. And so often we just don't think about that. And you've done such a good job of showing us that connected context temporally, not just in terms of taking a snapshot of where we are today, but how we've taken so long to get where we are. It's what we think today is based on hundreds of years of ideology and change.
Exactly. And what we're going through is not that much different from what people have been going through for 400 years. And so, if we learn from that, if we learn from the history of how we got here, it will help us understand the present more. But see, that's a different kind of epistemology than scientific epistemology, which addresses just the evidence here and now.
Oh, absolutely. Almost devoid of context, which yeah, can have pretty dire consequences as we've seen with like the Manhattan Project, for example, or any of those real extreme examples where, we basically are so narrowly focused on solving one problem or even just like throwing satellites up. We talk a lot about the space junk issue. Obviously, the technological problems that satellites have solved are huge. They are amazing. And life would be very different if we didn't have satellites. But sometimes we've got to think about, what happens when we just keep putting a bunch of shit up there. Like, where's it going to go? What happens when they start crashing into each other? Or, the plastic pollution problem. That's a great example. Plastic solves so many problems. It's such an important product. It also is wreaking havoc on the environment. We just didn't think about that in a contextual manner. And the thing is, these unintended consequences are sometimes blatantly obvious if we were to take a larger contextual view. There are definitely always the stories and the examples of people who were ringing those alarm bells early on because they saw the big picture. It's actually very rare to say, "Oh, nobody saw this coming." Someone did. We probably just didn't really listen to them. I've just got to say, you've done such a beautiful job in this book of kind of bringing things really full circle, but also raising, I think, a very important alarm, and not being afraid to kind of put these really tough issues in front of the reader, that maybe are a little bit uncomfortable to think about, but that are really, really important to think about. And so, number one, I want to thank you for that. And number two, I was hoping that, we're coming up on the hour point, that before we actually go, that maybe I can open things up and ask you the same two questions that I close every podcast with. Maybe before we do that, though, is there anything else that you feel like we didn't get to that we'd be really remiss not to mention?
Well, with respect to the last point, I just wanted to say that reminds me of another story that I tell in the book, which is of Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, which is exactly that point, which is that it's the story of somebody who was told, Dr. Frankenstein, who was told, to go ahead and just explore as far as he could and go into every corner of nature to discover things. And that the words that Mary Shelley used evoke words that Bacon and Descartes wrote. So it's a perfect example of someone who is encouraged to pursue knowledge as strongly as possible, but who then produced something that had unanticipated consequences.
Yeah, this idea of this kind of unfettered, unchecked. And one of the things that I think we often hear when we study science is, investigation for the sake of knowledge, studying, learning just for the sake of understanding is something that's very pure and something that should be celebrated. And although I agree with that, I only agree with it to an extent. Yeah, there is, there is always going to be something that we have to think about. And I think now we've got these more modern examples of that, like human genetic engineering, for example. CRISPR is a great example. Like, we got to be thinking of the ethics of this instead of just pushing the technology to the limit. But yeah, anyway. So Robert, I always close every episode with the same two questions, and like, as a philosopher, as a historian of science, as somebody who really grapples with these deep issues, and of course is presenting them to us in a way that we can grapple with them as well. I am going to be, I think, fascinated to hear your responses to these questions. But I have to warn you, they're kind of big picture, and I'm going to put you on the spot a little
Uh-oh,
bit.
I may have to
Um,
think about that.
no worries. So I want you to think about the future. which obviously you do. You do in your book, especially by relating it to the past. So when you think about the future in whatever context is relevant in your mind right now, so it could be big, 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 like cosmic level, or it could be maybe very personal. Number one, I want to know, what is the thing that truly does keep you up at night? If you had to pick one thing that you are really concerned about, maybe even pessimistic, maybe even cynical, like very deeply concerned about, what is that? And then on the flip side, so that we can end things on maybe a lighter note or a more positive note, um, what is the thing that you are truly, authentically optimistic about? Not playing lip service like the children are the future, although that might be it, but like at a deep level, what is it that when you think about it, you're like, okay, things are going to be okay. I'm actually really looking forward to this.
So your two questions are, what am I pessimistic about, and what I'm optimistic about? What
Yeah,
keeps
like
me up
what are
at night,
you
and what keeps me up at
exactly?
night, and what keeps me going?
And what keeps you going? Yeah, that's a good way to put
Yeah,
it.
I guess what keeps me up at night is the lack of enough good stories for people to realize what's happening to us. I mean, the way I put it at one point in the book is, science denial is like shouting "Stay put" in a burning building. And how do you get people to realize that the building is burning, and to listen to, and to reject the advice that's being shouted at you? So my fear is, what keeps me up is that the we don't have enough of those big stories, and it should be the task of the humanities to provide those stories. But the humanities are becoming increasingly specialized. So I'm really worried that the humanities aren't up to facing the problem that we need to face, which is of writing these big enough stories. Um, but on the flip side, what am I optimistic about? I'm optimistic uh, about the fact that we can write those stories, and it's the kind of thing I like to do, and I will continue working on it. So I think those stories can be written, compelling, vivid stories, with very strong characters and terrific plots that make clear to those who read them what's happening, what's going on, and what we have to do.
Here, here. Guys, the book is The Workshop and the World: What 10 Thinkers Can Teach Us About Science and Authority. Robert, thank you so much. I learned so much from you today, and I'm feeling really inspired here at the end of our chat.
Well, thank you, Cara. It was wonderful being on the program.
Absolutely. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.